I just wanted to quickly ask about Areo Magazine and what it is you guys do there.
Okay, so Aereo is where we're trying to have longer form, sort of thoughtful arguments about culture, politics, freedom of speech, liberalism. We're broadly liberal humanist, but that doesn't mean that we are left-wing or right-wing. We actually, according to analytics, lean slightly left, but that's not deliberate. So we try and encourage more conservative writers. We want to try and get views in from all over the place. What we want mostly is for people to make reasoned and evidenced arguments, to be balanced. We don't want hit jobs. We don't want obscure theoretical or theological or philosophical musings. We want people to make strong, clear arguments in which they are charitable and balanced, but put forward a view that somebody else might not have thought about.
Mm. And for anyone that doesn't know, I know you probably speak about this in every podcast you do or every interview you do, but for anyone that doesn't know, could you tell me about the grievance studies? Just summarize it for anyone that doesn't know, and if anyone hasn't, then they can always Google it. But I just thought it's important for people to know that.
So that was led by James Lindsay, my American colleague, and Peter Boghossian, the Portland philosopher. We had been concerned about the quality of some studies coming out of some sort of identity and cultural studies for some time. So we submitted a lot of really, really terrible papers to the journals that this stuff was coming out of. So we submitted a paper arguing that by examining dog genitals in a park in Portland, Oregon, we were able to claim that rape culture exists in nightclubs and that men should be trained like dogs. And we used Black feminist criminology completely irrelevantly to argue this, while presenting impossible data and then drawing unwarranted conclusions from it. That one got an award for being particularly important. Mm-hmm. And we wrote a number of papers like this. We intended to, our success rate was getting close to 100%, but we got caught for the dog park paper because it was so ridiculous. Journalists started digging around. They found the academic names we'd used didn't actually exist. So we had to come clean a bit earlier than we hoped. But we got 7 of the papers accepted, and we had 5 more that were progressing well through the system. And so we thought there's a limited sort of conclusion you can draw from this, and people have tried to draw too broad conclusions, but I think the conclusion that should be drawn is that in important areas in which we're studying racial, gender, and LGBT equality, it is not only acceptable, but in some journals expected, that you use really bad theory, unsubstantiated truth claims, and advocate for things which are essentially unethical. That's a problem if we actually care about social justice.
Mm-hmm. And that's leading us nicely into the book, which I've got here. Now I've got about halfway through. I'm not a very good reader, but I've got halfway through. And one of the things that I took that was comforting to me is, so last year I was studying digital sociology, and one of the courses I took was sociological theory. And a lot of the theories we spoke about were postmodern, so Foucault on power and stuff like that. And what I found comforting from the book was there was points where you were explaining how unnecessarily complex some of the theories are. And that was comforting to me because I did find it very difficult to understand. And I didn't have the intellect to understand any of the issues with it, but I did find it difficult to understand. So it was quite comforting to read that at least other people were. And so I was wondering if you could quickly summarize what postmodernism is and when it became applied postmodernism.
Okay, so postmodernism itself was a really, really huge phenomenon, and people often, quite rightly, criticize us for reducing it to a few core concepts. But the reason we do that is that these are the concepts which have continued and are still plaguing us today. So Foucault, as you mentioned, is especially important there. So his concept of power knowledge he argued that power and knowledge were so intertwined with each other that they should be considered the same thing, because it's the powerful forces in society that get to legitimize certain ways of knowing, certain truths as knowledge. Then this is accepted by the general population, and everybody speaks as though it is true. And this is his concept of discourses. So we have discourses which are ways of talking about things, and they're given to us by powerful forces in society, particularly things like science, which a lot of the postmodernists took aim at. Because generally, if we can say, well, there's a scientific study, then we feel quite confident that this is actual knowledge. So yeah, these knowledge, power knowledge is all about powerful forces creating knowledge and then perpetuating it through society on all levels by people speaking as though that knowledge is true. When this became applied, what we called applied postmodernism, was in the next wave, because the first postmodernists, they burnt themselves out. They were quite obscure and difficult to get hold of, as you mentioned, and also they really just took things apart. They didn't have reconstructive aims. So it was the next wave that kind of started in about 1989, when a lot of theorists all at once started writing, saying we need to use these postmodern concepts, but we've got to make them applicable. We can't do anything political if we're just dismantling everything all the time. We have to accept that power, these power balances exist, but we have to look at them. We should look at them in terms of identity, and where each kind of identity works in relation to power. And then we can look at them and try and dismantle them. So it was at this point that the power dynamics that the original postmodernists had spoken about more broadly became very much identity politics. So we have these powerful discourses called things like white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, ableism, and fat phobia. And these are understood to just permeate everything and determine how we think. Most of us are just wandering around in a fog of common sense, believing all of this, and we need these critical theorists to make us aware of the discourses, of the oppressive nature of them, to break them down for us and help us, and in some cases compel us to dismantle them.
And do you think this dismantling of objective truth and knowledge and almost forcing language, experience, and people's opinions as either just important or more important in objective science, do you think that's pushing the same sort of thing on the far right, where they might be believing conspiracy theories or fake news and stuff like that? Do you think the two of them push each other further out?
Absolutely. That's the thesis of a long manifesto written by James Lindsay and I, called A Manifesto Against the Enemies of Modernity, when we argue precisely that. So when we have the postmodernism and different ways of knowing on the left, and then we have post-truth and alternative facts on the right, we're seeing a very similar kind of thing. Matt McManus has recently written a book about what that he calls postmodern conservatism, and that is, it does work in the same way, but I think more essentially even than that, I think this is what we humans do. If we are left to our own devices, because we evolved to live in groups, and we survive best when we have common narratives. We're a storytelling species. Evolution has kind of designed us to live in groups, to believe what we want to be true, to have shared stories, and to be hostile to out groups and favorably inclined to in groups. So we have to fight against that fairly constantly, and that is what a liberal society does, a liberal society that values science and reason. Science is already a skeptical method. If it's done properly, and I concede it isn't always, and criticism of certain scientific studies are absolutely valid, but science as a method, when done properly, is skeptical. It tries to prove itself wrong. It wants to replicate itself. It will never accept that a hypothesis is proven. It can only be disproven. So this is the best system we have, alongside liberal tolerance of viewpoint diversity, that actually pushes back against these worst tribal storytelling aspects of our human nature. And that's what we have to really, I think, try to reinforce and hold on to.
And while we're talking about the dismantlement, do you think, it struck me that the postmodernists, there seemed to be some sort of hypocrisy in a lot of the theory. If we're trying to dismantle categories like male, female, masculine, feminine, it almost seems like they're also reinforcing categories based on marginalized groups and identities, so like races, genders, and stuff like that. Do you think there's a hypocrisy there, that they're wanting to dismantle categories, but only the categories that they see fit?
This is because what you're looking at here is two different kind of contradictory theories coming up against each other. So queer theory with Judith Butler particularly is the purest form of postmodernism, post-structuralism, she would insist, that still exists. It's all about the dismantling of the categories. But within things like trans activism and feminism, we also have critical race theory. Now that's the one that's moved furthest away from those postmodern ideas and has embraced identity politics the most strongly. So it's not denying objective truth. It's saying that there is an objective truth in which society works consistently in favor of white people against black people. And so we have this mix then where we have this intersectionality, where marginalized identities are seen as compounding each other and in need of special support. And that's coming up against queer theory, which says there can't be any of these categories. So we have this contradiction. I wouldn't really call it hypocritical, because Judith Butler and Kimberly Crenshaw weren't theorizing in the same way to begin with, although they both used the word intersection in the same year to mean the same thing, but they're still theorizing quite differently. And you're right, it's a contradiction. It doesn't work. Particularly in trans activism, which is where we see both of them, we cannot both claim that gender identity doesn't really exist, and also that it's absolutely real and must be accepted by everybody.
Yeah. And also, you distinguish in the book, I'm just going to read this from the iPad here. You distinguish between liberal mindsets, postmodernist mindsets, and applied postmodern mindsets. And applied postmodern mindsets differentiating with the other two with the statement, we must devalue white Western ways of knowing for belonging to white Westerners and promote Eastern ones. Now, here's kind of what I've taken from that, and you can maybe say if what I'm saying is right. So if we were to assume that postmodernism devalues objectivity in science, it seems that they're suggesting that Eastern ways of knowing aren't scientific and objective, and are almost, well, I think the word you use in the book is spiritual, but that to me sounds like they're vastly stereotyping Eastern countries. Is that I'm on the right page?
I certainly think so, yeah. I mean, the post-colonial theorist who has argued this most convincingly and very excessively is Meera Nanda. Now, she is wonderful. She has been, throughout the 90s and the science wars, she's been very concerned about post-colonial theorists taking this idea that science and reason are white and Western, and that the East has its own mystical, spiritual, traditional ways of knowing which need to be recognized as equally valuable. Now, she has argued that this really does reinforce stereotypes, and it's much more of a conservative impulse than a liberal one. So she has argued, for example, that she writes in the context of India, and she writes in the context of peasantry. So she's looking at the experiences mostly of poor Indian women, and it's not really helping them at all if they're not, if science is seen as a bad thing, if they can't progress in order to take advantage of the advances of science. And it is essentially racist. Here in the UK, we're having a problem with a lack of uptake of STEM. We are reliant on attracting doctors, scientists, and engineers from India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, just to keep us going. If all of the non-white people left the UK today, the NHS would collapse. So I think it is particularly insulting to argue that white Western science is something that is white and Western, and that it doesn't belong to the rest of the world. It's also ahistoric.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, just while we're talking about the theory, is so right now I'm studying philosophy, and a lot of the philosophers I'm looking at are white males. And it seems to me that postmodernists are almost trying to devalue what they've said. Do you think that's true? Like we should just disregard what they've said and favor more minority viewed theorists?
It depends on what they're saying. So a key figure in critical race theory, for example, is Angela Davis. Mm-hmm. Now, she was very much a Marxist. So she is not going to be critical of Marx, even though he was straight, white, and male. But and there are theorists who still very much cite Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard. So that, you know, there's still this appreciation for some of them. What they tend to target is reason, enlightenment, rationalism. Those are the philosophers who are seen as being white and Western and oppressive, while the postmodernists and the radical Marxists are seen as challenging this kind of hegemonic white Western power system, this masculinist system.
And I just want to move on to liberalism. So, what would you say is a true definition of liberalism, or what should be the aims of liberalism in your view?
So, looking at liberalism in its broadest definition, usually if I'm speaking to Americans, I have to explain I'm not talking about leftism. If I'm speaking to Australians, I have to explain I'm not talking about rightism. So hopefully speaking to you are going to make neither of those assumptions. But liberalism is essentially a system of conflict resolution. It believes in plurality. There should be a variety of viewpoints, and that's okay. It believes in the individual. So the individual is someone who should be enabled to reach their full potential, regardless of their race, gender, or sexuality. It also believes in universality. So we are all one human race. We can empathize across divides. We can want what is best for all humans. So there's this mixture of aims for freedom, appreciation of viewpoint diversity and plurality in liberalism, and there's this progressive aim. So what liberals are often criticized for is we're always going forwards, but not nearly as fast as the revolutionaries would like. So the Marxists and the social justice activists, who are really quite different things, will complain that we are too keen on the status quo. We want to fix things one problem at a time, but that's too slow, according to them. And then the conservatives see us as valuing progress for the sake of progress and not holding on to valuable traditions. But I think understanding liberalism as incremental reform in which society is made both more free and more fair is what defines the essence of liberalism.
Do you think if we're looking at humans as and universally, and we want freedoms for everyone, do you think that, for example, Sam Harris being critical of Islam for their treatment of LGBT individuals and women, do you think it's fair to say that that's a xenophobic thing to say? Whereas people on the left or people who call themselves liberals are very much for LGBT rights and women's rights, but as soon as we criticize religion, it seems like it's off limits.
Yeah, that's the one of the differences with social justice. They're not universalist and they're not individualist. They're very much culturally relativist. So whereas a liberal would say that it is always wrong to make women subordinate, it is always wrong to persecute LGBT. The identity politicians, the social justice left, will say that white Westerners have no grounds from which to criticize other cultures because they believe that knowledge is a cultural construct, because they believe that white Westerners think their own is superior just because it's their own, and that they really need to appreciate other cultures more because, you know, the British Empire did trample on a lot of cultures, and that can't really be denied. But there's a liberal way of going forwards with this, of accepting that the exploitation of other people is wrong, but the demand we should support, I think, the liberal humanists in every group, and we find them in Muslim, ex-Muslim, Muslim feminist groups. These are the ones that liberals should be supporting, not the social conservatives or extremists.
Yeah. Do you think it's almost the same when we're talking about redemption? So this is where maybe cancel culture comes into this, where a lot of people on the left believe in like prison reform, and they want a more rehabilitation centered prison, basically, without much of the punishment. But it's almost like as soon as someone makes an inappropriate joke or said maybe said something sexist 10 years ago in a tweet, their career is cancelled and they have no chance of redemption. And it just seems like there's hypocrisy there. I feel like we're getting a theme here.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot. We see feminist criticism of what they call carceral feminism, when they are not fans of the social the justice system generally. So yeah, that there is an element of that. There's that radical element that wants to abolish the police, abolish prisons, have different kinds of sort of reconciliation systems and reparations, and that there's a kind of utopian ideal that if we just make sure that everybody has their basic needs met in the first place, nobody will turn to crime. Mm-hmm. So there's that going on, and that I think is a separate thing to the issue of cancellation, and that comes down much more to the postmodern focus on language. If we believe, as they do, that language constructs social reality, then these discourses are spoken on every level of society, then it really matters how people are saying, whether it's the president of the United States or somebody with 6 followers on Twitter. If they say something problematic, it's seen as adding weight to this oppressive discourse that is hurting people. So a ton of bricks will descend on it. There's that need to obliterate that speech. I mean, I think the best example was after J.K. Rowling spoke about women's sex-based rights and women needing to be able to identify as women due to their biological makeup, their experiences physically of being women. The responses from a lot of the cast members of Harry Potter and from a lot of the critics was to repeat the mantra, trans women are women, trans women are women. So this is where we really saw the idea of the language. What J.K. Rowling did was she spoke into a discourse where trans women cannot be seen as women in every situation, that it was seen as perpetuating the oppressive discourse. So it was countered immediately by a lot of celebrities with that counter discourse, simply saying trans women are women. They didn't engage with the argument. There wasn't room for debate. It was the war of these two narratives.
Yeah, I think, well, I was speaking to a friend about this a couple of weeks ago about the J.K. Rowling case, and his point was that she maybe shouldn't have made some of the points she made, or how she made them, because of her being a children's author. And I'm not sure that holds, but do you think that's maybe a factor why people were so outraged?
I think it was, certainly, but it depends what you want children to know. I think the way J.K. Rowling spoke was from a place of knowledge. I don't think she said anything thoughtlessly. I think she took care with her words to express compassion and support for trans people, while also wanting women to be able to identify as women due to their biological makeup. So this, I don't think she would see as a damaging thing for children to learn. And so if trans activists think it is, and a lot of them of course do, they think that trans people need to be affirmed from as soon as they realize that they are trans, and this often happens in childhood. And so they could be deeply, deeply hurt by J.K. Rowling's words. But of course, we're learning now more and more evidence that there seems to be two things going on with the whole sort of trans issue. There are trans people. This seems to be undeniable. Some people simply do have this experience of not being the sex that their reproductive system suggests they are. Science, I think, will tell us why this is at some point. It's already giving some results. But there's also a social and political countercultural identity growing up. So we see, for example, whereas it used to be at least twice as many biological males who felt that they were really female as the other way around, now there are way more teenage girls biologically who think they are trans boys. And this switch, alongside a lot of political and ideological rhetoric, suggests that alongside the reality of some people being trans, there is an identity, a political identity of being trans, which makes it all extremely messy because you can't tell who is who, obviously. So it's likely, I think, I mean, what is this generation's emo or goth? I don't think there is one that we can really see. And I think that the politically trans-identified teens are this generation's emo and goth. And I think that that's going to be a problem because it means that the genuine trans people among them are going to be have a problem in the future, because I think there's going to be quite a mass desistance. And this will undermine the rights of trans people.
Yeah. I think there was also, I can't remember what doctor this was, but she was basically making a point, and people were trying to shut her down for being offensive, but a lot of the research she was quoting was saying that people who, children or teenagers, whatever you call it, who wanted to be the other, like the opposite gender of what their biology said, they changed their mind after they turned 18. A lot of them changed their mind, and the point she was making is that we shouldn't be allowing either those under 16 or those under 18 to undergo the surgery before they turn 18. And that a lot of people were offended by that. But I mean, the science was showing that most of them were changing their minds.
Yeah, I think 95, I think it was something like 95% of very small children who say that they're the sex, then later change their minds. After puberty, it's less common to change one's mind about that. But there's also a confusion going on culturally with how we look at things. So one thing I found very interesting in Abigail Schreier's recent book, Irreversible Damage, is that at the same time we've seen the increase of adolescent girls who believe themselves to be trans boys growing, we're seeing a disappearance of adolescent girls identifying as lesbians. So there's something there where a young person who is feeling that they don't quite fit in the normal average mold of feminine woman attracted to men, working out where they do fit. And I think culture can push them towards, well, you're actually a boy, rather than, well, you're actually a lesbian. So there's these two approaches, watchful waiting, which is to be supportive but not affirm anything, right, and allow the individual to work it out themselves in a sort of loving and safe environment where you can always talk about it. And there's this immediately affirm program, which can set kids onto a path which they then might later find it difficult to reverse, often because it's difficult for humans to say, I just went through 4 years, I changed my name, I had everybody accept this, and now I realized I was wrong. You could feel too embarrassed to say that. So it's, I don't know enough to have, and I don't think anyone knows enough to say precisely what is going on at the moment, but we certainly need to be keeping those discussions open and listening to a greater range of knowledgeable scientists and social scientists who are doing rigorous research.
Do you agree with raising children gender neutral? A lot of people are doing that now. Do you think that's a good thing?
I don't think it will work. I think if a parent wants to certainly provide their child with gender neutral clothing and toys and see what happens, I think most of the time they will find that the child behaves in quite gender typical ways, and sometimes they won't. And the times they won't, they'll grow up either to be a gender non-conforming heterosexual, a lesbian or gay man, or very occasionally a trans person.
Do you think, we're talking about parenting, do you think parenting might have an impact on this sort of cancel culture and this generation people are describing? I think it was Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. They spoke about this generation being very, very fragile compared to previous generations, and one of the aspects of that was parenting. I think millennials had helicopter parents where they're hovering over them, and iGen, which is this generation, have bulldozer parents where they're getting rid of all harm to their children, mental or physical. Do you think that's maybe contributing to why this whole culture is growing?
That's not my area of expertise at all, but I did find that book particularly interesting, and as you have noticed, we cited it in our chapter on how this is affecting the world. I think it certainly does seem to be true that parents are trying to protect children more from having normal feelings that go along with adolescence, and from taking the normal kind of risks that adolescents and even younger children need to take to learn about the world and develop resilience. So I'm quite convinced by the argument that we used to have really big things to worry about. If you had 14 pregnancies in my period of study, this late medieval time, you'd be likely to have 14 pregnancies, and then 2 of them would reach adulthood. So you had these worries about your children. Now nearly every child reaches adulthood. There are vaccinations for most illnesses. There are limited. We're all much safer, but that doesn't mean that the parental concern about safety is going to go away. It just focuses on smaller and smaller dangers. So I think sometimes, Jonathan Haidt, as he talks about the dangers that parents are protecting their children from, I think he himself is guilty of protecting his own children too much from internet culture. He's concerned about the impact of that on young girls, with reason. The increase in mental illness and suicide among young girls is a real phenomenon. But I I disagree with him a little bit there. I think that learning resilience with dealing with the online world is something that we can't protect children from either.
Right. Do you think we're in danger of oversimplifying complex issues? So this is like the issue that comes to mind is the tearing down of statues of people who own slaves. Do you think that's just a very like simple idea of a solution to a very complex problem that's not really going to make much of a change?
I think, yeah, I think there's a couple of questions in there. Are we in danger of simplifying things? Yes, I think that's what we do. We humans, we simplify everything. Where it comes to things like the tearing down of statues, I'm not overly concerned about that kind of action. So the statue of the slave trader in Bristol, I can't remember his name, that went up as a historical monument. People tore it down and they threw it in the sea. That also is actually a historical moment. There will be a history now of how the statue ended up in the sea. But you are correct in that this is pointing to a bigger issue in which we want to problematize the whole of history. We want to read it anachronistically because a lot of the great figures who brought us so much progress weren't perfect according to our understanding of morality right now. You know, there were people who were really racist, who were quite sexist. Darwin, I understand, believed that women were naturally intellectually inferior, and that this couldn't be changed. He was mistaken. I think he'd have been the first to admit he was mistaken had he lived long enough to see what the world is like now. But yes, I think that's a problem. I think we're going to problematize everybody. We sometimes see even Martin Luther King being problematized because he was a pacifist, because he had a universalist approach, and because he was, I don't know if I think activists would call it homophobic, because he had counseled a couple of young people who were gay on whether this was okay with Christianity, and he thought it wasn't. If I'm remembering correctly. But, you know, this is a devoutly Christian minister who is making huge changes to the world in the 1950s. We can allow him, don't you think, to be slightly outdated and slightly even wrong, morally wrong. We make moral progress on things like homosexuality.
I think the same sort of things happening with old movies, old music. Anything that doesn't hold to today's standards must be cut off, and we can't ever watch them or appreciate how good those movies were, as well as accepting that they might be offensive by today's standards. I just don't think we should be holding people. I mean, I think if you think in like 20 years' time, some of the things that we're saying now will not be okay, and I don't think we should be holding ourselves to that, to the future's moral standards.
I think, yeah. Again, like with I think the Luciano von Heydt book is relevant there. I think we are capable of more moral complexity. I think we can read a text that's written in, say, the 19th century, and we can sympathize with parts of it. We can recognize some morally good parts of it. We can think, wow, that was an attitude that really existed then. I'm so glad that's gone away. And I think that's something we can do.
Do you think with this activism that's happening, do you think there's class issues at play here as well? Because it seems that a lot of, well, maybe generalizing here, but a lot of the people who are wanting change in identities or gender or race come from the middle class, and that's maybe disillusioned those who in the working class, maybe those who are living paycheck to paycheck, which is maybe why those in the north in the last election here in the UK, they voted away from Labour, which is what they would usually be. It was the red wall. They ended up voting for the Conservatives, and they can maybe say the same thing about Trump in America. They just felt disillusioned. They didn't really care about these issues. They wanted to know where their money was going to be, or what they were going to do about poverty and stuff like that.
I certainly think the political left has increasingly failed the working class. Yeah, we get more statistics, I think, from the US. So we know that it is particularly middle-class white girls who are discovering trans identities, for example. It's not happening a lot among working-class Black girls. So there's obviously a cultural issue there. There's also the case where these big protests and movements form at the most elite universities. You know, Rhodes Must Fall, that happened at Oxford. Over in the US, it's the Ivy Leagues, which have the huge activist stance. People who are going to what are called community colleges in the US, or, you know, what used to be called polytechnics here, to learn a useful trade of some kind, a profession, don't tend to be doing this so much. It's kind of social justice, I think, is to a certain extent a luxury belief. It's something you can study and get into if you don't actually have to be earning a living. And that, I don't mean to be patronizing or dismissive about that. I recognize that I myself study social justice issues and postmodernism, and that's because I have the economic privilege to do so. I think people need to be doing so. We need to be looking at these kind of things, but there certainly is a failure of working class people. I think that red wall, we can't tell how much of that was to do with disillusionment of the Labour Party because of identity issues and how much was to do with Brexit. But I certainly think that, yeah, for the left to be electable again, we need to focus more on class and less on identity.
Yeah. And do you think, this is lastly before we move on to race, do you think that, you said in the book that now that homosexuality is legal in the West and sexual discrimination is illegal, that activists and postmodernists are now moving on to less tangible issues like prejudice and attitudes? How are they trying to fix that issue, and how would you fix that issue? Or how do you have any ideas on how to fix that issue, maybe?
I do. I think that, yeah, once the civil rights movements had achieved their legal goals, it wasn't as though racism, sexism and homophobia were just going to go away. What remained was to tackle attitudes. And I, as a young feminist coming of age in 1990, I had some fun doing that. Expectations that were made of me because I was a girl and then a woman. I needed to push back at that. But I think there are liberal ways of doing that, and there are social justice ways. And I don't believe that this kind of unconscious bias training that's going on, where it's assumed that everybody has been socialized into these racist or sexist or homophobic beliefs, is the way to do it. I think an individual should examine their own assumptions. I remember a couple of years ago having a chat with a young gay guy, and he said that he was in a committed relationship and he believed in monogamy. He wanted to get married and have one partner for his life. And I remember being slightly surprised by this because he was a gay man, and statistically gay men have more sexual partners. And so that's something that I could think about. Did I make an assumption about this man because of the statistics? That's something I should think about and not do, and try not to do again. I think we can do this kind of thing individually without having to accept that we all believe the things people like Robin DiAngelo says we do. There's a problem with individuality there. She tells us, for example, that we believe that Black people are less intelligent and less qualified. Now, where this is something that I think she grew up with in a poor neighborhood in America, but she's talking about the UK and other places as well. I went to a private school in East London, and the assumption I tended to make whenever I saw a Black adult is that they were a doctor, because this is what all my parents' families were. So you just simply can't take one context and impose it on everybody else. You need to understand that people's prejudices certainly can work culturally, but they can also work individually as well.
Yeah, and D'Angelo was the one that wrote White Fragility. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So the idea in that one was that we're either racist or anti-racist. Is that right? So we're either racist or if we're anti-racist, we're advocating for to reform race issues, and we have to be making an effort and doing a lot of these things. If we're not doing that, then we're racist. We're contributing to the issue. Is that right?
I think, no, there you're speaking more about Ibram Kendi. I think
Right.
he is the one who holds that everybody can be racist or anti-racist, and they can be either at different times. So I
Right.
like
Okay.
him a bit better because he does accept that, you're not naturally racist if you're white. This isn't, you have an individual choice there. However, he then goes quite authoritarian and unreasonable, so I don't recommend his work. But Robin DiAngelo is the one who believes that every single white person in a white dominant country, she speaks mostly of America, but she also references the UK, much of Europe, is socialized into believing themselves to be superior and more worthy and deserving of more benefits than Black people.
Mhm.
And she describes individuality as an ideology, and meritocracy as an ideology of the West that enables white supremacy. And we have to believe at all times that there is a power dynamic going on. So in one group, she put forward the tenet, the question is not, did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? So racism will always be manifesting, and the job is to find it. Now, I, as a liberal, reject that. I think people can and should reject the idea that we should evaluate our fellow humans by their skin color. I don't actually think it's that difficult to reject that idea. She does.
Right. And I'm curious what you'd think about this because I've been hearing a lot about um, groups in workplaces talking about, for example, Black Lives Matter, and maybe like there'll be like groups of 3 or 4, and they'll all be white, and people have said there's an issue with that. Now, I tend to think there's only there would be an issue if they were meeting every week to discuss Black Lives Matter and um, without speaking to people with the experience of it. If it was an ongoing thing, do you know what I mean? But I don't. People tend to have an issue with, like, say, 3 or 4 men talking about women's issues. That's an issue. You can't do that. Do you agree with that?
No, I think that's a standpoint epistemology. So we have this idea where only Black people can speak about racism, only white people can speak about sexism, and this simply doesn't work. There are different levels of knowledge, and there are different kinds of experiences that we can get at. I've just been being told by people who really enjoyed my work arguing against standpoint epistemology that I need to butt out of American politics because I don't have the right lived experience. So it's it's a kind of universal. I think if when we saw that there was a Saudi Arabia Women's Rights Council, wasn't there? And there was just a room and a great long panel, all full of men. There wasn't a single woman there, and I think that's not likely to be a coincidence. But if a group of men get together and they discuss women's issues, I don't see this as a problem if a woman doesn't happen to be there on that occasion. I've often discussed problems with racism when I have happened to be in a group of friends where all of us are white. I don't think we, and if we, even if we tried to do this, if we gathered a sample, suppose we went out onto the streets right now and gathered 100, say, Black Brits, and then we asked for their experiences, do you think we'd get a common politics, a common set of ethics? I don't think we would. If we have,
Well, it'd be a generalized thing to say that, wouldn't it? Or almost racist.
We would probably find, statistically, we'd find more of them supported Labour, but some were Conservative. We'd find they were possibly less in support of LGBT rights on average than the general population. So there's statistical things you can know, but going by standpoint epistemology, I mean, I challenge anybody to read Kimberly Crenshaw and then Candace Owens and then tell me that there is a consistent voice of the Black woman.
Well, even going back to like talking about what you can know about people statistically, that's objective science, and that's almost what we should be trusting more than what you're saying there is of experience and opinion.
Yeah, but what this is the brilliant thing about the science of gender difference particularly, is that it tells us that there are going to be different trends in what men and women are interested in, but that won't tell us anything about any individual. So just as we could guess that if all we knew about somebody was that they were 6 foot, we could make an educated guess that that person was a man. Now, 99 times out of 100, that guess would be correct, but the one time it was wrong, that doesn't mean that woman isn't a woman. So that's the kind of attitude that reality shows us when it comes to gender. Now, when it comes to race, I think the idea that there are biological differences in personality or intelligence between races is very, very fringe. And I'm also, I don't see much good coming from studying it on a social level. I think scientists should be allowed to study whatever they want, obviously, and it's important. But I think, again, when we're looking at race issues, I think culture becomes more important. So it probably, if we look in the UK example, Indian Brits are 4 times more likely to be doctors than the average Brits. Now, there probably isn't a system culture-wide that privileges Indians over white people. There probably isn't some genes that are more common in Indians that make them inclined to be good at being doctors. There is within the culture a particular respect for the medical profession. So, these are the kind of smaller cultural things that we have to look at, but sometimes we are prevented from doing this because then it is thought that we would blame certain groups who are underperforming for their own problems, for saying that their culture is the problem, that they're not trying hard enough, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. And that doesn't follow. That's too simplistic.
And just to finish up there, I want to read a statement from the book. So the statement goes, "It grows increasingly difficult and even dangerous to argue that people should be treated as individuals or to urge recognition of our shared humanity in the face of divisive and constraining identity politics." The question for you, I'm trying to end at least on some form of positive note, is do you have hope that we can get to a place in which arguing for people to be treated as individuals and for our shared humanity isn't an offensive argument to make?
I hope we can get there, but in the meantime, I suggest we just keep doing it. I suggest we just keep making friends with people who are different races and different sexes and have various sexualities and various gender identities, and treating them as human beings, and we will then discover that they are. And and just trying to make it happen. Resist the urge to tribalize in either direction, and just try to keep seeing everybody as an individual and recognizing that you can empathize with them, even if you have a great number of differences in background and experience.
And for anyone who wants to stay up to date with what you're doing or any of your work, where can people find you?
Well, Aereo is often where I publish things, also new discourses, but Twitter is where, on H Pluckrose, that's where most of my work, all of it ends up, if you want to keep up with it.
Perfect. Thank you very much for taking the time. It was it was an honor to have you on.
Oh, it was lovely to talk to you. I always particularly like speaking to people with Scottish accents, which is probably very problematic. See.
Thank you very much again for your time.
Okay, take care. Thanks, Gregor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.